Hello, students. Turn down this music. I tell you, I have so much fun preparing for these classes and listening to my music and sharing some of that with you all. Today's lecture, this is class 6 for individuals and families. We're going to spend some time talking about forming and assessing social work groups and intervening in social work groups. Also, just to kind of give you a heads up also that there is an entire topics class that's devoted to groups that'll go far, far more in depth than we'll cover on today. So that'll be something you can look forward to in coming weeks. So without any further ado, let's jump into our discussion for today. We are coming out of chapter 11, and we're also going to spend some time in chapter 16 and spending time again talking about forming and assessing social work groups. So a lot more to come from that as time goes on. So part of what we want to spend some time doing today, or what are the objectives of this particular chapter, is to really look at the steps that are involved in planning groups, developing individual and group goals, looking at recruiting, screening for members, understanding the ethical considerations, identifying an individual and group patterns or behaviors, and methods of communication, as well as the different types of groups, tasks, subgroups, things of that particular nature. So we'll spend a little time just talking about those things, but again, there is an entire topics course that's dedicated to this particular topic, so we won't spend an awful lot of time here, but this will be just an introduction for you. So when we think about classification of groups, just remember that groups fall into one of two categories. They are either treatment groups or they are task groups. Treatment groups are designed to actually address issues that clients might be having, let's say in any of these 5 areas that are highlighted here in the blue under treatment groups. So it's a cost-effective way to treat a number of people with similar issues at the same time, and is utilized quite extensively in social work as an intervention for working with various clients. Task groups, on the other hand, are different in that they are just that. They are a group that comes together, is pulled together for a specific task, where there's a specific item or agenda or project or outcome that they are working towards, and the goal of that particular group setting is nothing to do with treatment, but more to do about how do we set up and accomplish this particular task. So underneath here you can also see examples of what task groups look like. We need to spend some time talking about evidence-based practice, and you'll hear that terminology quite a bit as you matriculate through the program, but also recognize that it's a very important aspect of social work as we are moving to much more of a research-based profession. So thinking about things as we are setting up our groups in terms of ways to ask research questions to really gather some evidence as it relates to whether this particular format or this group structure or the methodology is actually effective. Again, so it requires us to use critical thinking. It requires you to look at specific variable measures. And it also requires you to really think broadly about what kinds of research questions are you going to need to ask as it relates to assessing the group, and how do you challenge that. So work that needs to continue to be done in that particular field, but something important for you to actually know about. When we're talking about the formulation of treatment groups, and if you remember, we just talked about treatment groups are groups that are designed to look at dealing with some aspect of treatment for the clients that are involved. So as you're thinking about forming these particular groups, looking at what the need for that particular group is, what the purpose might actually be, and you want to hear it from the agency that you might be working with, as well as the clients that you are actually going to be serving. What the leadership is going to look like, what's the composition of the group, how many people, who's going to be invited, who's there, who's not, whether it's going to be open-ended or closed, whether folks can join the group at any particular point in time, or does the group start at a certain point, running a certain number of sessions, and then starts over again. Size, location, frequency, and duration are all aspects of treatment groups that we need to take in consideration. So things to think about as it relates to your clients, for example. So let's think about whether, let's say, for example, you're looking at a treatment group that's going to provide support for single moms. We might want to look at the timing of the day in terms of when we do that. Given that there might be demands around work and around school. So as you're doing the planning piece, it's around thinking about all of those particular aspects around how do you get people there, what's going to be the benefit, the timing, where it's located, is childcare made available. All of those are things that you will need to think about in terms of the formulation of your group. Interviewing potential members is also a mechanism to think about or to look at as you are finding yourself in the need to put together a treatment group. And these are some of the things that you will want to look at in terms of what that interview might include as you're looking at building your client base for participation in that group. Determining the format. Is this going to be a group that has individual goals and behavior terms? And then how do we rank those? All of the things that are listed here in the blue are things to think about when we're determining the group format and how we're going to actually set up what the behavioral tasks actually are. Let me give you an example of a group that I developed many, many years ago that worked with a specific population. I worked with a local county agency that needed an intervention for drivers who had multiple DWIs, and so as a way to create a way to divert them from actually going into the criminal justice system, there was a treatment-based focus that looked at folks being willing to actually pay for this type of a program. It was cognitive behavioral in its approach, and so there were actually individual goals for the clients who actually came to those particular formats was to learn about the cognitive processes that take place when they drink and what needs to happen to resolve that, as well as there were behavioral terms around people not continuing to use or not continuing to be involved in that type of illegal behavior. So there were group goals as well as individual goals that each of the clients actually had to come up with. So when we're thinking about guidelines, how does the group make decisions? How does a group address issues? And these are things that you'll learn more about in your topics class, your group's topics class, as it relates to how do you set up structure and develop that group in terms of how the group is going to cooperate and what the leadership style will need to look like. So it's looking at all of these particular aspects in terms of setting up rules and guidelines for what needs to happen in the context of that group. And this is just an example of what a particular group format may look like. You may have start out with a check-in and having people, depending on the numbers, kind of talk about where they're coming from on this particular day or what's happening for them, reviewing the tasks and so forth, and spend the bulk of the time then actually focusing on what those tasks are, mutual problem solving, and then closing in 15 minutes. So that could be an example of what a 90-minute group might look like depending on what subject matter you're actually trying to cover. Then you also need to be aware that we need to have a way to assess this group process in terms of looking at whether the framework that you set up is actually working. Are folks understanding the content? Can you identify the roles of the members that are in the group? Can you look at functional behavior versus dysfunctional behavior when you start to look at individuals and their level of participation or their manner of participation in the group? As well as can we look at growth? And these are things sometimes that we'll need to contract out in terms of what we're going for or what we're looking at in terms of an overall purpose. Again, depending on the nature of the group, the clientele, and what the outcomes are, you might want to assess these particular areas as well. If you are looking at a group that works with individuals that have mental health disorders, or let's say are suffering from depression, then assessing cognitive patterns might be a very important aspect of looking at that group process to determine whether the actual mechanisms are working or not. Looking at sociograms, also looking at norms, values, and cohesion. Planning for those task groups, again, looking at who's your target population, what's your purpose, what are you trying to do, and how we're going to start to look at the membership and talk about whether it's open, closed, or otherwise. Task groups in organizations, when you're starting to look at, it's about clarifying, bringing people together with different areas of expertise to look at a common problem, and everyone plays a role in terms of how to organize around that particular problem or come up with a solution or come up with an outcome. So a little bit different in terms of its scope, but basically the planning pieces in terms of the formation is very similar. Paying attention to cultural considerations in terms of forming and assessing those groups. So again, as we live in a society that's becoming more and more diverse, we cannot overemphasize the importance of paying attention to cultural considerations as it relates to the work that you do in the group setting, because groups will continue to become more diverse, and having some knowledge around culture, background, knowing about stereotypes, biases, things of that particular nature are going to be very important for you to understand as you develop and put together or you start to do the formation for this group series. The ethics, always there, making sure that people understand about what's happening with the information that they share, understanding confidentialities and the exceptions, recognizing and appreciating people's right to self-determination, making sure that there's competent leadership, as well as we also looking at making sure that we don't discriminate against the folks that we're working with as well. Moving on to chapter 16, and this is intervening in social work groups. So we'll spend some time today here talking about that whole intervention process. And some of the things that we want to really look at in terms of a purpose for what we want to take away from this particular chapter are understanding the concepts of how group interventions or group interventions apply to those task groups. Understanding skills and knowledge needed to effectively intervene at each stage. We'll talk a little bit about the stages of the group. Being familiar with these particular phases of group, and understanding some common worker errors in terms of different phases of group. So spending a little time, again, just kind of digging a little deeper into that entire group process. So when we think about the development of the group, and different authors have slightly different takes in terms of that, but basically they're fairly similar. And so this particular author of this text, Hexburn, looks at the stages in a slightly different way than the coursework that's laid out for your group's work that talks about beginning, middle, and ending stages of group. And this breaks it into 5 different aspects of that. So again, looking at that group development through the pre-affiliation, power and control, intimacy, differentiation, and separation. So these are all phases that the groups will go through as they begin to develop. But for you as a group practitioner, it's very important for you to be aware of what's happening or being able to gauge where your group is in terms of the stages, because each stage requires some different types of methodology in terms of how you move forward with your group. So when we think about leadership, and so think about yourself as a social worker in that particular role, those characteristics that you will need to actually have as a group facilitator in terms of being able to shift your roles, being variable, knowing having a good grasp on the facilitation piece, and also your location even within the context of the group. Are you going to sit in the middle of the group? Are you sitting to the side? Are you pivotal? Are you on the periphery? And how are you engaging the folks in that group? And that might look different depending on the stage of development that that group might be in at that point. Also, as we think about the group series, so we've researched it, we put a plan together, we recruited the folks that we want to be in our group. We have a purpose, we have a mission, we have funding, we have space. We've worked through the logistics. And so now as we think about these various stages of development for this particular group that we just kind of shared a couple of slides ago, we need to also then think about what are some of the interventions that we need to be paying attention throughout the life of the group. And so if you've got a group that's running on a 12-week series, then these particular aspects around fostering cohesion, looking at the norms, attending to subgroups, paying attention to the leadership style, these are all things that will continue to ebb and flow over the course of that particular group. And you as the leader will need to be able to recognize when you need to intervene in any of these particular areas. So it's important to understand and know about them. These are some examples of the various stages in terms of the group process, and what we then actually take into consideration for you as that particular leader. So how are you going to get these things done? The pre-affiliation stage is looking at a certain scope of dynamics, and then the leader's role, as you can see, needs to adjust accordingly as well. And so power and control, which is another dynamic, really looks at these particular dynamics as it relates to what's happening in the group, and the focus for the leader is to your immediate right. Power and control continued. The differentiation stage. We're also looking at the separation stage. So we're moving towards the end, looking at things like evaluation, what the focus needs to be in terms of. So envision a treatment group that has been fairly successful, that's been running for the last 16 weeks. People have formed relationships. They've got linkages, and they have understanding and support. And now all of a sudden this has to come to an end. So as you think about the separation, there needs to be some planning on your part as a leader to think about how are we going to resolve this particular piece in terms of how we're going to move through and terminate these particular groups, and the impact that it may have on the clients that are a part of that group. This slide really just talks about the variations in terms of social worker groups. So there's we could do single group sessions on a point in time. Sometimes there are situations or circumstances that may lend themselves to, let's do this one session and we should be able to resolve the issues. And then technology mediated groups, so the use of well, actually technology like you're using here in your video lecture. The Adobe Connect process allows people to actually work via the internet in terms of real-time communication and the presentation of information. Again, so looking at those variations are going to be important. Working with those task groups also, we're looking at the problem identification, getting the members involved, and also being aware of those stages of development for those particular tasks that needs to be done as well. So that brings to a close the information that I had to share with all of you on today. So as always, we would really appreciate and encourage you to continue to read the chapter assignments so that you can come to class prepared for our in-class activities. Thank you, and I will see you in class.